Is it okay for the church to get involved in the public arena? Should Christians be actively involved in the free elections of the United States of America? Faith Wins is an organization dedicated to engaging pastors, congregations, and Christians in the public arena. Why, you may ask? Because the influence of Christians needs to be felt around this country. Jesus is the solution, and we need to bring biblical solutions to the marketplace of ideas before it's too late, and we need to do it now. There are over 80 million eligible Christian voters in this country, but only 30 million regularly participate in the elections. This needs to change, and Chad Connelly is going to tell you why in just a minute. Check us out online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. When we sit on the sidelines and hope for a better future, the enemy wins. When we mobilize, register, and make our voices heard, faith wins every time. Thanks for tuning in today to the Faith Wins podcast. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I'm joined today by Faith Wins founder, Chad Connelly. Chad, welcome to the show.
Hey, Jim. How you doing today?
Good. I want to talk about voter registration because you got me amped up on the last show, and it's so important that we actually talk about this because it's okay. I mean, let's just talk about that letter. You said that there's a guy out there that sends letters to churches telling them that it's illegal for them to hold a voter registration.
Yeah, it's part of the mass misinformation program. There's a group called American Separation for the Separation of Church and State. There's a guy called the Reverend Barry Lynn. Now, you and I may question the Reverend part, but there's a letter that goes out to a church.
You get a Reverend thing for $15 online anytime.
Yeah, exactly. And but he just wants to intimidate churches. He is a total leftist. He appears to be anti-American. He's certainly extra and anti-biblical. He doesn't read the Bible like my pastor buddies and I read it and you read it. He doesn't see that we should be involved in the political process. I'd love to ask him how he treats Matthew 5 and how he thinks we're supposed to be salt and light in the political arena and in the public arena if we're not voting and registering to vote. And I'd love to see what he thinks is illegal about a church conducting a non-partisan voter registration drive. There's certainly nothing wrong with it, and I believe it's an obligation, should be an obligation of every pastor and faith leader in the churches in America.
All right, so let's talk about registration numbers, just to remind people, because on a past podcast, you said some things that just irritated the living daylights out of me and actually caused me to want to throw up.
Yes.
You said that there's a potential voting block of church-going United States of American citizens of 82 million people, but only 27 to 30 million of them actually vote. But there's 30 million of them that are registered that don't vote, and another 20 plus million of them that aren't even registered. Talk to me about that. How can the church fix this problem?
Well, I think it's a tragedy, and we wonder why there are elected officials who do things that are anti-biblical or extra-biblical or so far out of the biblical worldview realm. It's our fault, Jim. It's our responsibility. By everybody's definition, there are somewhere between 40 and 50 million people sitting in churches on a typical Sunday that don't exercise their right to vote. If you figure that half of those are not registered and the other half aren't registered and don't vote, or are registered and do vote, we got a problem. We don't have to lose any election at any level, not from city council to school board to county council to state house to state senate to Congress to Senate to president. The Christian vote is the biggest voting block in modern political history. The places that I've sat in politics showed me that even the political people don't understand it and appreciate it, but certainly the churches don't.
So really, is it that there's people suppressing the Christian vote, or that are Christians doing that on their own?
A little of both, I think. I think that there are leftist groups that call themselves Christian groups that don't want to have biblical influence in the public arena. That's a big part of it. They've certainly done a good job intimidating and talking some pastors out of it. I mean, this whole misinformation campaign, that's illegal. You can't do voter registration drive in your church. That's nonsense. That's dishonesty, in fact. I mean, think about it. If there's no freedom of speech in the pulpit, it's nowhere else either. In fact, one thing that we did at Faith Wins is we printed a form that shows the legal do's and don'ts, what churches can and cannot do in politics. And if you go to our faithwins.us site, this is a downloadable PDF. You can put it on a screen at church. You can overcome that person in the in the pews who's been so misinformed. I believe pastors would be stunned at how much they legally can do as a pastor in church versus what they've been told by the misinformation. So yeah, there's a suppression campaign. The media every couple years, or maybe a couple times a year, will throw out a story. The church-going people in America are dwindling. The numbers are going down. We're familiar with those stories. But if you read down into the story, it's the mainline churches that are dying, the ones that have removed biblical truth and some chapters and verses because they were
And Jesus.
uncomfortable.
Yeah, they
And
removed Jesus too, yeah.
But 9 or 10 paragraphs in, it'll say, well, the evangelical church is growing. So if we're following through on our mandate to go and spread the gospel and to talk to people about the good news of Jesus Christ, those churches are growing, but they don't like to tell that part. It's the mainline churches that deny Jesus and are coming up with all sorts of new names and things that replace the gospel. And you and I know what all those are. And most of the listeners do too. They're just trying to replace the truth with some kind of falsehood.
So
That works.
How does Faith Winds come alongside a church to help them set up and execute a voter registration drive?
I learned pretty quickly running GOP Faith. I got to be the first ever national director of faith engagement that was full time. Campaigns and parties had done it, but no national party had done it year round and made it an ongoing effort. So I went to those 43 states and spoke to 80-something thousand pastors. I learned pretty quickly, you got to get the influencer. Political parties see pastors as data points. They're influencers. The Barna Group also says one of the biggest reasons people go vote is somebody they respect tells them it's important. So you and I know that the pastor's respected. They're already in a place of influence. And if they tell people it's important, then that's likely to have more influence over the people in the pews to actually go and execute that vote at election day.
All right. But we live in a post-COVID-19 world where the pastor hasn't really been in the presence of his parishioners for 4 or 5 months as of today. So do they still have the same amount of influence, or do we need to change this conversation because that influence is waning? I don't know.
Hey, I think they're going to have more. I think that one of the first places people are going to trust, and look, you guys, you know this too, the media has gone full on to talk about how much coronavirus is coming in churches. Of course, there's no coverage of tens of thousands of protesters who are crawling over each other and not wearing masks, not socially distancing. A lot of them are stoned or high or drunk or whatever. No stories come out about protesters pass on the virus, but it seems like every church since instance gets highlighted. So I believe, though, that one of the most trusted places that people go back to first is going to be the church. I believe people are going to flock to church. I believe people are looking for answers in the midst of all this disruption and distraction and anger out there. And I believe the pastor, I believe one thing God's doing through this, Jim, is restoring the pastor as God's leader and God's person in these times.
So how does a church get started setting up a voter registration drive? We're like 98, 97. When we're recording this podcast, we're under 100 days to the next major election in the United States of America. How do you get started? Is it too late?
No, it's easy. Look, we're going to target 2 back-to-back Sundays in September. We'll pick the last 2 in September because truly some churches haven't been back long and some are only partially back. We believe by then the media is going to run out a lot of things to write about this deal. And I think we're going to figure this program out and people are going to be back in church. Hopefully not, if not in full force, very close. So we're going to pick the last 2 Sundays of September. We're going to do a national voter registration drive. We have videos and step-by-step how-to on our faithwinds.us site, but it's really easy. I'll tell you a quick story. In 2014, I was in Alaska, met a pastor named Dr. Jerry Prevost, and I met him, told him my testimony, and he said, "What are you doing tonight?" It happened to be a Wednesday, and I said, "I'm coming to hear you preach tonight. I'm in Alaska. I'm away from home." He said, "I'm not preaching tonight." I said, "Well, who is?" He said, "I want you to come tell your testimony." And so sure enough, he gave me his pulpit, but when he introduced me, he said, "I believe it's sinful for the people of God not to be involved in the voting process." He said, "That is why everybody who's in here and all of you watching on TV probably know that every Sunday year round out in the front of our church, we run voter registration. It's easy. You put a table out there, you find somebody in your church that cares about this." And I tell pastors, Jim, there is somebody, and it comes to mind immediately. Who's that guy or lady in your church who's so angry about what's going on and wants to change it throwing stuff at the TV at night going, what are we going to do? Let them run voter registration drive. There are links to the forms for every state on how to do voter registration and also the forms to complete. The old story from Dr. Jerry Falwell, the way he did voter registration. He'd have a couple Sundays like this, like we're picking the last 2 in September, and he would just do 2 back-to-back to make sure he catches everybody that's there. Stand up if you're registered to vote. Give them a hand. That is fantastic. They are exercising their Christian obligation and their rights as an American citizen. They're voting. Now, if you're still seated, here come the ushers. They're going to give you a voter registration drive. You drop that off when you leave the foyer after church this morning, and we'll turn those in for you. There are some different persnickety rules, but that's the basis of it. Put a table in the back, have the voter registration forms ready, have somebody there that's familiar with the state's rules, have them filled out. Basically, if you've got your name, address, and phone number memorized, you're going to have it kicked, and fill it out and get it turned into the election commission. It's so one thing I mentioned. It's got to be done about 30 days before the election to be counted.
So there's a time limit. You can't just register to vote the day before the election.
Some states I'm working with the folks in Colorado. You can register that day on the day of the election. So there are some stories. We'll push those states later, but right now we're going to be in a lot of the states that have that 30-day window. We're going to push for a national drive on those 2 Sundays regardless, though.
So we're not expecting the pastors to run this thing. We're expecting that they already know somebody within their church that is passionate about this, that can take charge of this.
Every single time. I mean, and there's some churches the pastor wants to do it. I think it's important if the pastor just talks about it. You know, we call it a civic Sunday. Have a civic Sunday. And in times past, I've spoken at dozens and dozens of churches in a bunch of different states. They'll do one around Memorial Day or around July 4th or around Veterans Day. But this year with a major national election, we're going to push for those last 2 Sundays in September. And so that is kind of something we get into a habit. But yeah, every church has somebody that's just so involved in this. They care about it. They might be involved in a local party effort. They might be involved with a campaign. Or maybe they're just, some concerned American who says, boy, we got to maximize the Christian vote. Let them go to our site. We'll get them the information. Goodness, they can email me and I'll get it to them directly.
When you said on your site earlier that there's a video that goes through the 6 steps to setting up a voter registration in the church, what do you know what some of those steps are off the top of your head?
Yeah. It's simple.
What is it?
It's get permission first. Talk to the pastor and make sure he mentions it. Put a table out there in the back at a place where there's a heavy traffic flow. Have ink pens. Have the pertinent statewide voter registration documents that we have links to. And then just talk to people about it. You registered to vote. If the pastor will say, if you're not registered, go to the table, or we'll hand them out, then that table just becomes a collection point. And then whoever's in charge just has to take that to the county election commission. Some states have different rules. That's why we have a link for every single state on faithwins.us too.
So you guys can help them figure out exactly how to get it done.
Yes. It really is easy. It's not as much to it as you think.
So out there in FaithWins, lots of resources, faithwins.us. Everything they really need in order to pull this off is out there for them.
Absolutely. And let me give you another way you can do it. We have a texting feature, and we actually are setting this up. We're going to be pushing this throughout August and September, and we'll do it in October for the other states. But you can text to our FaithWins number. It's 76076. All this will be on the faithwins.us site as well. And you just text the word vote, and we'll send you a link for your exact state to get registered.
All right.
But we make it easy.
So let's just talk about the problem we've got. The problem is, you said earlier that we got 82 million potential voters going to church. We only got 27 million to 30 million of them actually voting in an election. And there's still another 20 to 30 million of them that are registered that don't vote. How do we get them to vote? Because it's one thing to get them registered. It's another thing to get them into the voting booth.
Well, this is what the political scientists spend an awful lot of time on, right? Is they call them low propensity voters, and they do everything they can to advertise to them. It comes down to the individual's decision. They just don't think it matters. They don't think their vote counts. They're frustrated with the process. They're mad at the party. And it's still, no matter what your reason or excuse, nothing removes our Christian responsibility from engagement. One of my pastor buddies has a great quote and this is about God, but it's also about us. He said, it's inconceivable that the God who created human government would want his own people to be not involved in it. And I think that's a message to pastors, to leaders, deacons, church council members, Sunday school teachers, for goodness sakes. We ought to all be encouraging everybody. When believers hear a message from people they respect, they respond. And we've got to talk to them and draw these reasons out so they understand the importance. Your vote can make a major difference. Some of the elections come down to small numbers. Jim, I told the story when I was with you last week in Florida that there's a city near here, the Human Rights Campaign pushed this whole bathroom freedom idea. It's a major city in the South, and a mayor who ran for election was elected with 6% of the eligible people that could have voted in that election came out and voted. 6%. That means, and one of the first things that this person did was push bathroom freedom, and now it's swept the country. That came because, think about it, what if one or two churches had said, this is important, go vote your values. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for or what party to vote for, but find out what they believe in. Jim, I think a lot of that too goes back to the pastor not understanding what they legally can and can't do. That's why I showed you that PDF and that link for church do's and don'ts on our site.
Well, show that form again, because really the bottom line to this is it is legal, Chad. It's legal to hold a voter registration in our church, and it's legal for the pastor to talk about it. And we're going to talk about what the pastor should be talking about in a future podcast. But I mean, we're talking just let's teach the values and teach our constituents, the people in the congregation, to vote their values.
That's exactly right. And I mentioned that book, U-Turn, by David Barton and George Barna. The disparity between what the congregation's hearing the pastor teach on and what the pastor thinks they're teaching on is wide. And people in the congregation want to know how a pastor feels about things of the day. I believe pastors should be talking about every issue of the day, the current events that matter, and making those line up with what in the Bible talks about this. Right. You know, think about all the disruption and disorder going on. God's not a God of disorder. He's a God of order. He's a God of peace. He's a God of, he understands how things work. They fit together well. When you see disruption, distraction, destruction, and trashing and looting and burning, that's not a godly thing. Pastors should be talking to their people about what's going on and helping them cut through the clutter and the noise. I think most Christians out there who are watching this podcast understand most of the media is not on our side. They don't have a biblical worldview. I don't know how many of them are Christians or claim Christ as their Savior, but the fact is they're not exhibiting a biblical worldview in very much of the media. They're not really given the free press side. It's up to us to find out what the truth is. And it's going to take a pastor, a Sunday school teacher, a leader helping cut through that clutter a lot of times.
Chad, we're out of time, but I want to say thank you. Thanks for Faith Wins. Thanks for what you guys are doing out there. And I look forward to being together on another future Faith Wins podcast. Thanks, Chad.
Thank you, sir.
And remember that when you register to vote and actually vote according to your biblical values, Faith wins. Hey, thanks for listening to the Faith Wins podcast with Faith Wins founder, Chad Connelly. I'm your host, Jim Brangenberg, and I want to ask you to check out Faith Wins online at faithwins.us. That's faithwins.us. Your vote is needed and necessary, and we all need to learn to engage in our system of free elections right here in the United States of America. If you're not registered to vote, please take time to do so on your local county voter registration website and do it today. In an upcoming election, vote for candidates supporting biblical values and a biblical worldview. Until next time, remember, when Christians engage in the public arena, faith wins.